Welcome to the temporary John Jay Homestead. I am Melissa Vale, trustee of the Friends and chair of the Scholars Committee, and we are excited to have so many of you here, especially in the middle of spring vacation and the sloppy weather outside. We think that today felt like spring, so anyway, welcome and welcome to the spring. Everyone, please turn off your phones. See, I told you I was going to say that. Yeah. This year has a different format from past years because we're not having a live stream tonight. While Bedford Playhouse does a tech upgrade, we miss it, and we'll tell you as soon as we can resume. But in the meantime, we'll be recording tonight, and we'll share that on our YouTube channel as soon as we can, and we'll let you know when it's up. And if you know of anyone who wants it, make sure that we know to tell them too. For the Q&A later, we have note cards and pencils, which we'll gather toward the end of Victoria's talk and offer from up here, along with a whole bunch that we've already gathered. We'll give you a chance later if you want a card, so give us some good questions. Now, some thank yous to Booksy Galore for so competently handling our book signings, to Bedford Playhouse for taking us in during the closing of Bedford House. Please go to the Friends website and Instagram for updates. Special thanks to our Scholars Committee, listed on the back of your program, for their indispensable support of these talks, and to our outstanding public partner, the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, for everything. And as always, and most important, thanks to our members who are our reason for being. Quick show of hands, how many of you are members? Oh, that's good. Thank you, and thank you in advance to those of you who will join soon. Now, so it is spring outside. We hope it's going to stay like that. But write down May 2nd for our farm market opening, and check the website and our calendars for much more than that, especially in this semi-quincentennial year of the 250th. To see all the ways that the homestead is more than relevant, even though the house is closed. With our next Scholars Talk, Akil Amar on April 9th, James Traub on May 5th, our exciting exhibit at the Katona Museum of Art opening on June 27th, progress reports on our house restoration project, and more of our own events and those where we partner with other fantastic organizations, local and more widely scattered. Now, here is a Zoom feature that we're keeping, the survey, the audience survey. David Hosack was all about medicinal botany and the cultural life of New York City in the founding era. So I am going to ask two series of questions. I just want a show of hands. Please don't overthink. And Haley or Heidi, could you please keep a rough count? Haley's going to keep a rough count. First question, how many of you here have used homeopathic or botanical treatments, not conventional or allopathic, for illnesses? Raise your hand. Okay, I think that's about half, right? Good. Okay. Now, of the New York City cultural organizations that Hosack was involved with founding, including their precursors, how many of the following have you visited, used, or supported? The New York Botanic Garden. Almost good. The College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia. Smaller. The New York Historical Society. Almost everyone. The Humane Society. A couple. The Rutgers Medical College. Okay. And the Lying In Hospital, which is now the obstetrical program at New York Presbyterian. Yeah, I'll raise my hand for that too. There's more too, including some where the line from precursor to surviving institution gets a little blurry, but this is just an example of how influential this guy was. Now, the last part from me before you get to hear our speaker. Those of you who've come to our talks know that we always look for a J connection to the topic of the evening. Here we have two stories, one family-centered and one political. For the family story, look inside your program for our reproduction of a page from Maria J. Banier's Pressed Flower book. This was what people did. It's so beautiful. This is an example of how central botany was to the life of the Jays, but it's also a statement of how special it is that we have something so fragile and precious in our collection. Our second story involves how Hosack overlapped with the political events of the day. See this portrait, one of the treasures of the Homestead's collection. It's by Samuel F.B. Morse, of John Clarkson Jay, John Jay's grandson. Matthew Clarkson, this subject's grandfather, figures with both Hosack and John Jay in the Doctors' Riot of 1788. Jay, Madison, and Hamilton were writing the Federalist Papers, Jay having completed numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5, and Hosack was becoming interested in medicine. It was then the responsibility of medical students to supply cadavers for dissections, which were accepted in Europe but controversial in this country. Two sources of bodies were the newly executed and the African burial ground. But in 1788, there was a rumor that a grave of a fancier person at Trinity Church had been ransacked. A mob gathered, heading toward the anatomy lab of Richard Bailey, who had taught dissection to Hosack. New York's mayor locked a bunch of doctors and medical students in the jail for their protection. Hosack raced toward Columbia to protect his anatomical preparations and was hit in the head with a rock. At the same time, John Jay was at home when Matthew Clarkson, this grandfather, came to borrow a sword to go to the jail and defend the doctors there. Jay went with him and was likewise hit in the head with a rock. Different rock. He fell ill the next day and didn't resume work on the Federalist until his last contribution, number 64. Matthew Clarkson's daughter, Mary, went on to marry John Jay's son, Peter Augustus, and they produced this John Clarkson Jay. I tell this story to show how closely connected were the elites of the period and how very close they were to the emergence of modern science, including communications, and possibly also concussion management. Now, finally, on to our speaker. Victoria Johnson is a writer and professor of urban policy and planning at Hunter College in New York City, where she teaches the history of philanthropy, not-for-profits, and New York City. American Eden was a finalist for the National Book Award for Nonfiction, the Pulitzer Prize for History, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Biography, among many other best of lists and awards. Watch for her next book about Frederick Church coming out in May. Welcome, Victoria Johnson.
Okay, I'm on. Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for inviting me to join you this evening. This is the first talk out of about 150 talks on American Eden where people have been eating popcorn, which happens to be my favorite food, so I look forward to some of that afterwards. And I also want to thank, in addition to Melissa, I want to thank Heidi Stryker for all her work organizing my visit tonight. And now I'd like to take you south to New York City and back in time. A young doctor is rushing down a New York City street to the bedside of a 15-year-old boy. The doctor's name was David Hosack, and he was just 28 years old. He entered a townhouse at number 26 Broadway, and he was shown to a bedroom where he found the boy in the grip of a terrible fever, likely typhus or scarlet fever. The boy was delirious then unconscious, then delirious again. Hosack sent the boy's distraught mother out of the room so she wouldn't have to watch her son die. And he dispatched a courier to bring the boy's father home from a business trip to Connecticut. Hosack later said he was certain the boy would be dead before dawn. Now, he knew that his more experienced colleagues would have tried to bring the fever down with cold cloths pressed to the skin, but that hadn't helped the boy. So instead, he chose a very risky measure. He chose heat, trying to break the fever without killing the boy. He drew a steaming bath, and he mixed a botanical remedy into the water, Peruvian bark, made from the cinchona tree native to the Andes. Next, he sprinkled in smelling salts, and then he lowered the boy's limp body into the bath and waited. Within minutes, the boy's pulse quickened and he began to regain his senses. Hosack repeated the treatment, and then he wrapped the boy in warm blankets to continue the sweating and carried him to a bed where the boy slept deeply for several hours before awaking past all danger. Now, Hosack refused to leave the house that night. He was exhausted after the hours of anxious effort. He allowed himself simply to doze in a nearby bedroom. And suddenly, he bolted awake to find the boy's father kneeling at his bedside. It was Alexander Hamilton. Taking Hosack's hand with tears in his eyes, Hamilton thanked Hosack for saving the life of his precious eldest son, Philip. And in that moment, Hosack became the trusted friend and advisor to one of the nation's most famous and powerful men. But Hosack's medical intuition that night did more than forge a bond between a founding father and a young physician. It moved Hosack one step closer to an idea he had quietly been nursing for 3 years. After the night, he saved Philip Hamilton's life with the help of a medicinal plant. Hosack spent all of his spare energies, and you will hear tonight a little snippet of how extraordinarily energetic he was. He was exhausting to study, to track through the archives. He was so energetic and adventurous. And he spent all of his spare energies founding the nation's first public botanical garden. Why a botanical garden? Well, Hosack was born in 1769. He was a native New Yorker, and he grew up during the British occupation of the island during the Revolutionary War, and he was surrounded by chaos, by blood, death, and disease. And in this uncertain, dangerous world, he began to dream of becoming a doctor. So in 1786, at the age of 17, he enrolled at Columbia College, which had recently been renamed, no longer called King's College, and he began to study medicine, and he fell madly in love with the field. He was most attached to dissection, to anatomy, because in the age before X-rays and MRIs, this was the only way to see the miraculous world hidden beneath the human skin. Now, Hosack, while he was a student, engaged in this doctor's riot, doctor's mob, sometimes called, as Melissa described. And after that event, a number of doctors and medical students and medical professors left town for a little while until tempers cooled. And he went to Princeton to finish his medical studies, and then he went on to Philadelphia to study with the most famous doctor in the United States, Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signatory to the Declaration of Independence and very prominent doctor. After studying with Rush, Hosack went to, very entrepreneurial, he went to Alexandria, Virginia to set up his first medical practice near the new capital of the United States, which was then under construction at Washington. He set up his medical practice, but he attracted very few patients. He quickly learned that Americans, for all their pride in the young nation and its new institutions, they still preferred their doctors to come with European credentials. Medicine had been much more established for many hundreds of years in Europe. So Hosack followed in Benjamin Rush's footsteps and sailed for further study at the greatest medical faculty in the Western world, which was at the University of Edinburgh. Now, many of you have surely been to the United Kingdom, and you know that Britain was blanketed in gardens then as now. And it was in Edinburgh that Hosack discovered his life's other great passion besides medicine, namely botany. He learned, while studying with his professors at the Royal Botanic Garden of Edinburgh, he learned that for British and European doctors, botanical gardens served as classrooms, laboratories, encyclopedias, pharmacies, all rolled into one. But he also learned that no one knew a surefire way to tell what it was about a particular plant that helped in a particular illness, and no one had developed a reliable way to discover and isolate new plant-based medicines in the wild. Now, this was an age when the vast majority of medicines came from the plant world. By far, when you pick up this Edinburgh New Dispensatory, which had all the medicines known to doctors at the time, just a few pages would have been devoted to medicines made from animal matter or minerals. The rest came from plants. And Hosack caught fire with a passion to help advance medical botany and to try to find new cures for the ailments that plagued so many people. Well, he decided to study a second year. He went to London, which was then the capital of British botany. And he went and studied for a full year both in a botanical garden and went collecting in the wild with his teacher there. And he studied in the collections of the great Carl Linnaeus at the Linnaean Society of London. And when Hosack returned to New York in the summer of 1794, he was inadvertently one of the best trained Linnaean botanists in the United States. He had gone to become a doctor, a better doctor, and he had come home a very promising botanist. He went back to New York City, where he was from, and he set up a medical practice there, and he was very quickly appointed a professor of medicine and of pharmacology and botany at Columbia College, his alma mater. He was just in his mid-20s at this point. Now, Columbia College then was, like the rest of New York City, located in the bottom tip of Manhattan Island. The picture of Columbia, the inset there, that was the main building, College Hall, and the bottom right corner of that inset is pointing to the College Hall on the map. That's where Columbia was located then. Hosack was an incredibly charismatic and confident human being. When he was in Edinburgh, he had studied both his professors and the ministers in church on the weekends to see who had the best speaking techniques, what they were, to learn them. And when he went back when he became a professor in New York, he delivered electrifying lectures that his students left notes. We still have many, many notes from his students in the archives at Columbia, and they wrote down even his jokes in their notebooks. And one of his students wrote home to his own parents that when Professor Hosack, quote, undertakes to please, he is as good as the theater. Now, as a professor, I can tell you that is an extraordinary teaching evaluation. He insisted to his students that the United States deserved doctors just as skilled and knowledgeable as Europe's, but he found it so frustrating that he had no botanical garden to teach them in. So he lobbied friends, colleagues, and politicians for the money he needed to buy land, hire gardeners, collect plants from all over the world, and he couldn't quite make people see what he was getting at because they didn't understand what this institution was. There was no such thing as a public botanical garden of the sort that Hosack had seen in Great Britain. Some people even mocked him publicly. At a time when Manhattan was covered with fields and farms and even some groves of trees left, when you could walk along Broadway and pick plants in the ditches, when just north of the city line looked like this in the 1790s. You can see the spires of Trinity Church there and St. Paul's. You can see College Hall. And this is today of an intersection in Soho. It's the intersection of Grand and Mott Streets. So at a time when Manhattan looked like this, why would you fence in a plot of land to grow more plants? People just could not understand what Hosack was trying to do. They couldn't see what he could see, what he had learned, that medicine was changing, and the systematic scientific understanding of the chemical nature of plants and other remedies was about to emerge as the foundation of modern medicine. Hosack was fascinated by the human body. He saw it as a mysterious country full of unknown terrain that called for intrepid new explorers. All around him, adults and children were dying of diseases whose causes no one fully understood: typhus, scarlet fever, yellow fever, diphtheria, cancer, consumption, apoplexy, diabetes, liver disease, syphilis, smallpox, on and on. And the available medicines sometimes helped sick patients. They often did nothing, or they even hastened death, which was the case with a very popular treatment at the time, bloodletting. Well, Hosack wanted to try to find gentler and more effective medicines, and a public botanical garden was his brilliant answer to this desperate situation. So, after a couple of years of trying to get money out of the state of New York and out of Columbia, after he saved Philip Hamilton's life with the help of a medicinal plant in 1797, he just decided, I am going to have to do this myself and show people what I'm doing. And perhaps then they will come and support me. It's the story of many a dreamer and entrepreneur even today. So he decided he would scrounge together money. He borrowed a great deal of money, and he bought a parcel of farmland. It was at the heart of Manhattan, 20 acres. To get there, you went 3.5 miles north of New York City's northern border to up a country lane called the Middle Road. It went up the spine of the island and therefore was called the Middle Road. And this piece of land, try to imagine, it was covered in violets and viburnum and grand old oak trees, and it was hilly, and you could see Long Island and the Palisades from it. And he went on a spending spree. He eventually spent more than $1 million in today's money out of his own pocket and mostly borrowing from creditors. He hired gardeners to lay out and till new plant beds. He hired laborers to pull down old fences and barns. And he did everything he could to turn this parcel of rocky farmland into his own American Eden. He began to write people all over the country and the world, pleading for every kind of plant, seeds, dried specimens, living plants. He wanted everything he could get his hands on, whether medicinal, of course, but also ornamental, because who knew what ornamental plant might actually have a medicine coursing through its veins, unknown to doctors. He wanted agricultural plants to help make the young United States more self-sufficient. He wanted commercially useful plants. He wanted to grow an arboretum to test different trees for their utility in building. One of his great dreams for the garden was to find native species, to discover medicines that grew locally that could replace these very hard to import and very expensive plants like the Peruvian bark he had used in saving Philip Hamilton's life. So with two of his nephews, and who came to work with him, and his Columbia students, he went tramping all through the fields of Manhattan, Long Island, and New Jersey, collecting every kind of plant he could he could find. This is a specimen, one of the specimens held at the New York Botanical Garden in their extraordinary herbarium. It is labeled in his handwriting, which I came to know extremely well over the course of my research. It is labeled in his handwriting. And when I presented on this at this this talk, and I presented this picture, the president then of the New York Botanical Garden was in the back, and he told me afterwards, he was chuckling because I said that you can see there are different labels on here. Botanists were arguing over what plant this was, and he said they're still arguing over what plant is what. And indeed, I wrote to an expert on this particular grass, and he said it's got multiple names still. So Hosack was really pioneering collecting these native species. Now, he named the garden the Elgin Botanic Garden, which was named after his father's hometown in Scotland. It was not a very smart choice because that name did not mean much to anyone but people of Scots descent in New York City. He should have named it the New York Botanical Garden. But he chose the Elgin Botanic Garden, and he built an extraordinary structure. We're very used to seeing buildings like this today, but at the time, there was one of its scale that we know of for sure in the United States, and that was on a private estate outside Philadelphia. It was a central greenhouse flanked by two hothouses, 20 feet tall, almost 200 feet long, and he filled it with plants from all over the world in the first decade of the 19th century. And when visitors walked in, they said they were enveloped in a swirl of colors and aromas, plants they had never laid eyes on before. He even had a coffee tree from Arabia growing there. He had plants from Egypt and China and Peru and Japan and India, the Cape of Good Hope, the West Indies, on and on. By the end of his collecting, he had well over 2,000 species of plants, an extraordinary collection. For someone working essentially alone in Manhattan at the dawn of the 19th century. Now, Hosack had an unstoppable drive to turn this botanical garden into a major scientific institution for the young republic. What he did with this collections, he conducted some of the first systematic pharmacological research in the United States. He brought into being the next generation of American doctors, training them in the scientific method that he had learned at the heart of the Scottish Enlightenment. Not just how to care for their patients, but how to conduct systematic scientific research so that when they went on and moved far past where his generation was, they had these scientific methods. He invited his fellow citizens to help map the continent's native species before it was overrun by invasives, which they were already worrying about at the dawn of the 19th century. He called for citywide tree planting for beauty and public health at a time when many of his fellow citizens were razing trees to the ground. And he was the original urban gardener, experimenting with fruits and vegetables and grains by day and mingling with his cosmopolitan friends by night. Now, because of his garden, in part because of his garden, Hosack became one of the most famous Americans of his generation. Now, the politicians were, of course, more famous. But among other Americans, he was one of the most famous, both at home and abroad. European botanists named plants for him, which is an extraordinary honor. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of London, another extraordinary honor for an American. Two of Napoleon's botanists came to study with him in Manhattan. He earned praise from the likes of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson also sent Hosack seeds that people would mail to him or that he collected in Monticello. He would send on to Hosack, knowing of his great garden. The great explorers Alexander von Humboldt and Sir Joseph Banks both lavished praise on him. And when the Marquis de Lafayette and Alexis de Tocqueville on their separate visits came to tour New York, Hosack was the one who showed them around among the other dignitaries. But it wasn't only Hosack's work on the garden that brought him this acclaim. Hosack was a generation younger than the founders. So imagine you are a teenage boy growing up in Manhattan, And on the streets passing you are the likes of John Jay, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, and others who had brought a great nation into being, had fought an empire and won a war. Now, if you were that teenage boy, what can heroism possibly look like to your generation? What can you do to make your mark? Well, for Hosack and many of his peers, especially his best friend from college forward, DeWitt Clinton, the answer was to found the institutions that would anchor that young republic, that would nurture it, that would possibly even bring it some respect in the eyes of haughty Europe. When Hosack was in Great Britain studying, he wrote home to his mentor, Benjamin Rush. He said, "The Brits are being so nice to me. It's very surprising given that we recently fought a war." He said, "They're so kind, but quietly, quote, they are waiting for the American experiment to fail." They might still be. He decided when he came home that he was going to make sure that the American experiment didn't fail. And his way of contributing was to found the civic institutions, some of which Melissa mentioned. And here's where the exhausting part of studying this man came in. I thought I was writing a book solely about a botanical garden. And as I followed Hosack's life and work, I realized that he had had his hand in an astonishing array of institutions. In addition to the Elgin Garden, he founded or co-founded the New York Historical Society, the city's first Museum of Fine Arts, the city's first Museum of Natural History, its first Horticultural Society, its first obstetrics hospital, its first public schools with his friend DeWitt Clinton, its first school for the deaf, its first mental hospital, and there's more. He started with his botanical garden and he ended by helping make New York, New York, the nation's greatest city for the arts and sciences. Well, after Hosack had worked on his garden for a little while, his friend and patient, Alexander Hamilton, was laying out the grounds of his country house, the Grange, in northern Manhattan. And Hamilton's law office and townhouse were down in lower Manhattan, and he would ride up the island, and sometimes he would stop at the Elgin Botanic Garden to get plant cuttings and horticultural advice from his friend and physician, David Hosack. Jefferson thought he was a terrible gardener, and he wrote to a friend around this time a wonderful line. He said, "Horticulture is a pastime, quote, for which I am as little fitted as President Jefferson is to guide the helm of the United States." He was not a Jefferson fan. So Hosack helped Hamilton, and they were very dear friends. Hosack was the family physician, but he wasn't only the Hamilton's family physician. He was also the physician to Aaron Burr and Burr's daughter, Theodosia. So when Hamilton and Burr got embroiled in the war of written words that culminated in the duel in 1804, Hosack was the logical choice to be the attending physician. It was one of the few things that Burr and Hamilton could agree on. So on the morning of July 11th, 1804, Hosack climbed into a boat at the edge of Manhattan with Hamilton and Hamilton's second, a lawyer named Nathaniel Pendleton. They were rowed across the Hudson to New Jersey, where there was a popular dueling ground kind of hidden up the hillside from the river. Hosack was left on the beach below the dueling ground, so he wouldn't be an eyewitness in the case of legal proceedings. And Hamilton and Pendleton went up the hill into the underbrush to the dueling ground. And I tried, when I was writing this book, to imagine what it was like for Hosack standing on this gorgeous summer morning on one of the most majestic rivers in the world, waiting for the sound of pistol fire and not knowing which of your friends you will be called to find wounded or even dead. Hosack waited on the beach, and after a few minutes, he heard a shot, and then he heard another shot, and then he heard someone shouting his name, and he raced up to the dueling ground, and what he saw there, he later said he would never forget for the rest of his days. He saw Hamilton lying on the ground, half cradled in Pendleton's arms. Hosack said his face was a countenance of death. Hamilton was still alive, but just barely. They got him into the boat. He was rowed back across the Hudson, and Hosack desperately tried to keep Hamilton alive on the way. Hamilton was delirious and fainting with terrible pain. Hosack probed the wound in Hamilton's abdomen, trying to reach the bullet, but it was so painful that Hamilton fainted and he stopped. Hosack was with Hamilton's family at his bedside when Hamilton died the next day. Hosack was absolutely devastated by this death. Hamilton was the man he admired most in the world. And that's why I was so shocked to discover that Hosack stayed friends with Aaron Burr. I couldn't understand this, and I think the day I learned that in the archives, I kind of closed my computer and went home and didn't want anything to do with him for a day. And I just couldn't understand it. And then as I did more research, it became clear to me. I found a letter Hosack wrote. It was about his friend DeWitt Clinton. He didn't agree with DeWitt Clinton politically, but they were best friends. And he wrote a letter nominating DeWitt Clinton to the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And he told the official at the American Philosophical Society, I don't agree with his politics, but he's a man of science. DeWitt Clinton was an accomplished polymath in many different fields. And he said, Hosack said, science, quote, knows not party politics. And that principle of neutrality allowed him to stay close with Aaron Burr for the rest of their lives. And Hosack was the one who took care of Theodosia, Burr's adult daughter, when Burr fled the country and Theodosia was very, very ill. Now, after the duel, Hosack went back to work on the botanical garden, and he had amassed this extraordinary collection. He was growing experimental fields of grains. He had a magnificent arboretum coming up on the perimeter of this 20-acre property. He had this glorious botanical, the greenhouse and hothouses, and he was training medical students. And the state of New York finally understood what he was trying to do. Albany, after many, many trips Hosack made up the Hudson to lobby in Albany, he succeeded in getting the state to purchase the garden from him. He had gone into great debt, and they purchased the garden from him, and they renamed it the State Botanic Garden. He had realized his great dream for this scientific institution. Well, a couple of years later, Columbia was bothering the state for a loan, and the state said, we have no money, but we have this land, this botanical garden, you can have that. And the trustees of Columbia, the archives are filled with griping about having been given 20 acres at the heart of Manhattan. They didn't want this land, it was too far north of town, and the botanical garden was very expensive to maintain. So Hosack began to realize that Columbia wasn't committed to maintaining the garden, and he kept going and trying to take care of it. But gradually, Columbia began to realize that it had landed a very valuable piece of real estate. As the grid rolled up Manhattan Island, first on paper, then actual roads being built, it became clear that this was an incredible property to own as a college. The middle road became Fifth Avenue. The property was bordered to the west by 6th Avenue. North 51st Street, to the south 48th Street. This green box is the outline of Hosack's former property. And you can see the footprint of the greenhouse, the greenhouse and hothouses up in the upper left corner. So Hosack watched in horror as Columbia let the garden go to ruin. The glass panes fell from the hothouse roof and shattered on the floors. Weeds grew up in the flower beds. And possibly worst of all, his extraordinary collection of plants that had been sent to him by the likes of Alexander von Humboldt. He'd gathered these plants from all over the world, were put on a cart by Columbia's so-called caretaker and taken downtown and sold in a shop like common produce. Hosack finally gave up. And what has happened to Hosack's land? Yes, so by the 1870s, Columbia was leasing the land to developers who were building apartment buildings on it. It was blanketed in apartment buildings. And by the 1920s, John D. Rockefeller, who had grown up in the neighborhood on 54th Street, was dreaming of building a monumental complex of cultural and commercial buildings. And he knew that there was this extraordinary single-owned parcel of land, very rare in Manhattan at that point to have 20 acres owned by one owner. He knew Columbia owned it, and he went to Columbia and he said, I would like to buy your land. And they said, no, we'll lease you 11 acres. And Rockefeller Center was built on leased land. By the 1930s, the late 1930s, there were 14 buildings, including 30 Rockefeller Plaza, and Radio City Music Hall was built on the footprint of Hosack's former conservatory. Think about that next time you walk by there. Now, by this point, Hosack's garden had really vanished in both physically and in our national memory, but not before he had done so much with this institution that has come forward through the decades, the centuries to us today. He trained this next generation of American doctors, and he brought into being, helped bring into being, he was one of the major figures in creating a field of professional botanists where there had been almost none before in the United States. Botanists were gentlemen polymaths or dabbling nurserymen, but Hosack helped professionalize this field of botany. And there, some of his students went on to found one of the greatest gardens on the planet, the New York Botanical Garden. And that garden, in turn, influenced the creation of gardens and arboretum all across the United States. And there are hundreds of them today, fulfilling a dream that Hosack had to have a national network of botanical gardens. Now, if you go to Hosack's land, he is very subtly present there still today. He is hovering in the channel gardens between the buildings there. He is, I always think of him when I see the farmer's market in front of 30 Rockefeller Plaza and the rooftop gardens. And he's there in a really charming and totally unexpected way that emerged right after I published American Eden in an independent development that then I got pulled into, which is the Elgin Restaurant on 48th Street on Hosack's former property still. It's just across from Rockefeller Center, but it was part of his land. And if you look at, well, this restaurant is filled with images of Hamilton and Burr and Hosack, and it's also got beautiful pressed plant specimens on the wall, pressed by Daniel Atha, who is here with us tonight, who is the world's expert on the plants of the New York region. And Daniel pressed gorgeous plants that line the walls when you walk into this restaurant, and they represent plants that Hosack was growing on that property. And if you look at where this arrow is pointing, you can see a small plaque in the sidewalk, and this plaque is a nod to a plaque that until a few years ago hung in Rockefeller Center itself. You can see the plaque here in the picture. If you turned your back to the old Middle Road, now Fifth Avenue, you would see this plaque that read, in memory of David Hosack, botanist, physician, man of science, and citizen of the world. On this site, he developed the famous Elgin Botanic Garden. Thank you.
Do you have some questions for me? If you want to write a question, raise your hand, and Haley will bring you a card and a pencil. And I've got a bunch of questions that have been pre-submitted. And I'll start with, what is your favorite plant that he grew or cared about or whatever? What's your favorite plant? Answer it however you want.
I have to say it's a very humble plant, but Eupatorium perfoliatum, which is a plant that Hosack loved because it had a property of making you sweat. It was a sudorific. And this is the tail end of the humoral understanding of the body, where illness was thought to be a kind of imbalance of certain bodily fluids, or too much blood, or something in the bloodstream that needed to be sweated out. This was long before the discovery of microbes and their role in, microbes had been discovered, but their role in many of these illnesses was unknown. So this Eupatorium perfoliatum was Hosack's choice when he contracted yellow fever in one of the many epidemics. And he decided that he would test this sweating method. And it also, unfortunately, made you, well, they thought that was a good thing. That made you throw up as well, because that might get rid of some of the other bad things. And he treasured this plant because it had some of the properties that something like Peruvian bark had. It didn't have quinine, which Peruvian bark had, but it did have the sudorific properties. And one of my favorite things about this plant is that he said he learned about it, get this, he learned about it from the, quote, country folk of Manhattan, which I love.
Another question about remedies. How many of these remedies have you tried? I'm sure you did thorough research.
I tried 0, especially bloodletting. Hosack was somebody who, he was trying to get away from these drastic treatments like bloodletting, but he did, in fact, there is a letter he wrote where he said, after one heavy meal, bloodletting, they used this device that raked through your skin and, let this blood out in a waiting bowl. And he said, after one heavy meal, I indulged in a little bloodletting and I felt much better. I definitely did not try bloodletting. And, I have used some of the same, echinacea and other immune support kinds of things, but I have not tried any of the, in fact, at the beginning of the book, I put a disclaimer saying that this was not a medical guide, because I didn't want anybody trying out what Hosack was trying, because some of it was, we have moved beyond it. There are certainly valuable plant remedies that we still use, that he was using, but some of it you wouldn't want to touch.
So Peruvian bark is quinine, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And did he develop a native source for Peruvian bark?
He tried to grow cinchona trees in Manhattan. It did not work.
Didn't work. Was it ever concluded that Hamilton's son was suffering from malaria?
We don't know what he had. And he probably actually had typhus or scarlet fever. And it's not clear at all what efficacy Hosack's remedies had in that process. Hosack was convinced, because Philip Hamilton was about to die and all the other doctors the older doctors had failed, and he really was at death's door, and Hosack succeeded in saving him, but had he had malaria, quinine wouldn't have worked in minutes. So it was something to do with the stimulation of the circulatory system and the sweating, which means it was unlikely that he had malaria. Yeah.
There's a lot in your book about artists and the friendship with a lot of European artists, a lot of American artists, the Hudson River School, and you didn't have time to do. You'll have to bring you back for another talk. Could you talk about his exceptional aesthetic sense and his relationship with Thomas Cole? We do have a collection item, which is a Thomas Cole painting, but it's too fragile to bring here, and the frame needs to be conserved or whatever. But so we have some cool stuff also.
Well, I hope to see that someday.
Uh-huh.
Hosack, I think in part because of his time in Edinburgh and then particularly London, if you spend time with the likes of Sir Joseph Banks, you're going to see some wonderful art on the walls. And I think he got an aesthetic training, an aesthetic education, along with the medical and botanical training in Scotland and London. When he returned to the United States, for a long time he was not well off. He didn't earn much as a doctor. He started a family and had a growing family, spent so much money he didn't have on the botanical garden. It wasn't until a bit later in his life that he was able to start collecting art. And particularly, so he lost his first wife in childbirth, and he lost the baby. And so that was one of the reasons he was particularly interested in obstetrics. And he knew that if his wife had died, think about the very impoverished women who were not receiving any medical treatment, and that's why he started the obstetrics, the lying in hospital. But his second wife lived, they were married happily for 2 decades, and then after she died, possibly from cancer, he remarried, and he remarried brilliantly. He married the widow of one of his former creditors on the botanical garden, and she was extraordinarily wealthy. And I couldn't tell the story here, but he retreated after he gave up on Columbia, not giving him the garden back. He retreated up the Hudson to a very beautiful house that had belonged to his mentor, Samuel Bard, and he had it enlarged. And he began to collect art for that, with his wife's money, and for that house particularly. And one of the great things I stumbled across in working on this book was that he ran into Thomas Cole in the street. And Thomas Cole was trying to scrape up funds to go see European ruins so he could get his aesthetic education. And Cole was trying to offload a couple of paintings he hadn't been able to sell for a year. And Hosack made him an offer on the spot. And one of them was, this is so perfect, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And I think, it's one of the most famous paintings in American history. I think Hosack bought it with that twinkle in his eye, and also maybe a tear, knowing he had been expelled from his Eden. And he took it home and hung it on the wall. And that money helped Thomas Cole go take this European voyage.
Fantastic. How many of these remedies were known to native peoples?
It's such an important question. And, one thing I was at first surprised by and gradually came to understand as a historian, I was surprised by how little credit. I mean, really, the Bartram family in Philadelphia was quite open about crediting native people they had learned from on their travels, John and his son William. But the next generation, Hosack's generation, they were very quiet about anything they might have learned from native peoples. Those country folk of Manhattan surely learned about some of those remedies from the Lenape, but that was not mentioned. And I was troubled by that and confused by it. And then I began to realize that the issue was, for this young republic, once they had severed from Great Britain, and they were so insecure, well into the 19th century, about their standing culturally and scientifically, they were constantly being branded by European scientists as a savage nation, including the European settlers. It's a savage land. Nothing good can come out of there artistically or scientifically. It's backwards. So to give credit to native people for that generation, I think they felt they would be playing into this critique they were getting from Europe. And so Hosack, I never found a single mention in his writing of having learned something even indirectly from native people. But we know that was where some of the knowledge certainly came from.
Yeah.
because the native peoples were expert at
Yeah.
recognizing and using these plants.
Yeah. When he received plants from people like von Humboldt, was it because he contracted with them to get plants, or did he send people out, or was it just donations, or was it a combination of all of those things?
It was there was an international network of botanical exchange, and the understanding was that if you send me something, then in the future I'm bound to send you. I'm obligated to send you something. I mean, there were selfish people who didn't, and and then their botanist friends elsewhere would lament. I gave him all of these extraordinary plants, and I got nothing in return. But there was an expectation that you. If someone sent you a plant from an expedition in South America, that you might send something from North America to them.
But in your book, you say that Clark, or Lewis and Clark from that expedition, gave him nothing when they returned, or at least at the moment of return.
Yes, it was. That was a very complex story. But Jefferson, Hosack wrote. So I showed you that plant that was collected on September 6, 1806. 4 days later, Hosack wrote to Jefferson, unrelatedly, but I love seeing these, what is he doing day to day? He wrote to Jefferson and he said, I have the beginnings of a botanical garden. When the gentlemen come back from their expedition out west, could you please send me some of their specimens? I mean, he's writing to the President of the United States, and that's when he said also, I think you should send out another expedition. I know where it should go. I know who should lead it. He had a great idea for an expedition leader, not him because he was busy in New York. But he just bossed Jefferson around in this letter. And Jefferson wrote back one sentence saying, two sentences. One, thank you for your letter. And two, should it ever be, and I'm paraphrasing, but should it ever be in my power to help you, I will do so then. He did not send any specimens from the Lewis and Clark expedition. But the botanist who was put in charge of organizing those specimens after Lewis and Clark came back ended up working for Hosack and possibly brought some of those specimens to the garden. But then the War of 1812 broke out and he went to London with them.
Right, and that was that. Why? What made you decide to write about this man?
It was a love affair. I was working on an academic paper about botanical gardens. I'm an organizational sociologist by training. I love the natural environment, and I thought, botanical gardens, I'll study this. And while I was reading about the history of the New York Botanical Garden, I was reading a wonderful book called Britain, as in Nathaniel Lord Britton, the founder of the Botanical Garden, with his wife Elizabeth Gertrude Britton, Britain's Botanical Empire. And in the first couple of pages, there was a chapter about precursor gardens, and I read 2 pages that said there was a man named David Hosack. He founded the first public botanical garden in New York and in the United States, and now it's Rockefeller Center. And that was it. That was it. It was like getting hit by lightning. It was that I saw my love across the room. In fact, my sister used to call David Hosack your dead lover. I don't know what happened. I was kind of primed. I love cities. I love New York City. I love history. I love gardens. And I just didn't, how could that be that this institution from 200 years ago was on farmland and now it's Rockefeller Center? And I had to uncover that story. And that was such a gift that the universe gave me that I felt that passion, because that's hard work, going to 30 different archives for years and years and years. And I felt pulled forward. It wasn't even my motivation. I felt so inspired.
Because the man lived everywhere and he was involved in everything.
Yeah.
You must have gone to 30 archives. Did you have a favorite discovery? What was your best source?
I loved going to the New York Botanical Garden because, in the Mertz Library, they're one of possibly the greatest botanical library on the planet. They had the copies of Linnaeus, of his books that Hosack wrote carefully. He bought them in London and he brought them back, and they said D. Hosack, 1793. And it almost makes me cry now thinking about it. I can open that and see that actual volume and that handwriting of that young man falling in love with the natural world and dreaming of trying to understand it. And so working there and in the herbarium, seeing those, seeing a plant that was actually picked 200 something years ago on Manhattan Island. Not just a picture of it, but that plant, saved through the artistry of people like Daniel Atha, that art of pressing and saving plants that allows botanists and historians to see them, not to touch them. I wouldn't touch them, but to see them so many years later. Those were extraordinary, but there were a million other things. It was just fascinating for years. And I would just want to say one reason Hosack's papers were in so many archives is that because he wasn't famous the way the politicians were, the way John Jay, his papers weren't edited, collected in one place. And so they were just scattered everywhere. So.
A different topic. What can you tell us about the history of lilacs and their origins?
Nothing. Daniel could possibly say something, but that is not an area of my expertise.
Okay. Well, we've got to stop.
Okay.
But thank you for taking us back to a New York that was just learning to be culturally and commercially ambitious. Audience, Victoria is going to be signing books upstairs. Come and buy one, and come to our upcoming events, including, I know we'll get you back to talk about Frederick Church. And if you want to know more about the Scholars Committee, give us a call. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Victoria.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you.